Chapter 21, we now look at the stative verb and we'll look at additional tense options for the perfect. So far you've learned the call and you've learned the perfect, the imperfect, the volatives, the imperatives. You've learned all the infinitives, the participles. You've learned all the call. What you've learned so far we call the standard verb, but there's another type of verb in the call, and that's called a stative verb. A stative verb is a verb that's really a conjugated adjective. It's basically taking an adjective and converting it into a verb. And so if you look at section 1 of chapter 21, where I have an introduction, and notice to be heavy, to be great, to be small, you can see that these words are adjectives, and they've simply been converted into a verb. Stative verbs are very much like standard verbs in the call, but there are some differences, and so we especially want to take note of those differences. The major place where the differences occur is in what's called the thematic vowel. And as you recall, the thematic vowel is that vowel that occurs under the second root letter. And that vowel, of course, is the most changeable vowel of the verb, being able to lengthen and pause to a long vowel and be able to shorten to a vocal schwa if you have a vocalic ending with it. But now also we're going to see that the vowel is going to change here with the stative verb. And so because of the changing of the vowel, it's going to be more helpful, I think, to look at these vowels as colors. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have different colors for the vowels. And so for the patach, I'll just write a box for a letter. These are letters. And so for just the thematic vowel now, we're going to make these all thematic vowels. We're going to use red for the patach. We're going to use green for a sere, but this will also include a hirik yod also. And then for the holum, we're going to use orange. And again, this is going to help us see the changes in colors that we have in the stative verb as compared to the standard verb. And so again, as just the stative verbs, we're going to have different colors. Again, red for your patach, and sometimes kamets, but basically it's all patach. And again, green for sere, and also for hirik yod, and then the orange for the holum, and of course the kametz chatuf. Okay. Well, when we look at the stative verbs, what we see here is, again, the thematic vowels being different. And so we want to look at the thematic vowels here. What we have here is we have first of all, the standard verb. And this is what you've learned so far. What you've learned so far is that in the perfect, and this backslash here, what's left of the backslash, that's going to be the perfect. And what is right of the backslash, that is your imperfect and your imperative. So we're not including here things like the infinitive and the participle. Now, of course, when we talk about imperfect, we would also apply that to jussives, and of course, the cohortative, you're usually going to have reduction. And so we want to apply this also to the jussives, too. But on the left of the backslash, we're looking at the thematic vowel that goes for the perfect. When we look at right of the backslash here, what we're looking at here is the thematic vowel for the imperfect and the imperative. And so what you've learned so far is like for katav or katol, or katal, what you have is a patach that would go under the tav here for your perfect. But if you were to put this verb into an imperfect, you would say yik tov with the holum here. And so that's what happens with the standard verb that you've learned so far. But there's other choices also that you have not learned yet, but you'll learn later. And that is, again, you can have a patach in a word like natan, and you've seen this word natan already. But in the imperfect and the imperative, which you've not seen yet, you're going to get a sere. And so you're going to say something like yitain here. You're going to have a sere here under the tav. And then you're also going to have another type of verb where, again, you have a patach in the perfect, where you say shalach. There'd be a patach under the lamed here. But in the imperfect and in the imperative, you also have a patach. So you'd say something like yishlach. And in the imperative, you'd say shalach. you see, with a patach. And so you can see how in the standard verb, your thematic vowel in the perfect is always read. It's always patach. But when you go to your imperfect imperative, that's where variation can occur. That's where you can have orange, that's where you can have green, or that's where you can have red. And again, this would be a holam, this would be sered, this would be patach. And so you can see in the standard, this is where the real change is going to occur here. Now, you really don't know, just by looking at a root, you don't always know which option you're going to get here. That's something that has to be learned by observation. But most of them follow, the standard verbs, most of them follow this first category, where it's red in the perfect and orange in the imperfect and the imperative. The green option you have for Natan is fairly rare. It'll occur usually with verbs that begin with either this particular root or with a yod at the beginning is where you'll see the greens. The reds here usually occur with roots that end in an R3 guttural or an R2 guttural. You'll get the red. But other than those general principles, they do have to be learned by observation. Now, as we come to the stative, the situation is just reversed, really. If you notice in the stative, it's always read in your imperfect and your imperative. Whereas, again, remember in the standard, it's always read in the perfect. So you can see quite the contrast between stative verbs and standard verbs, between the standard, the way the perfect's all read, but in the stative, it's the imperfect imperative that's all read. And where the change really occurs is here in the perfect for the stative. For the stative, you can get a green, and for the perfect, and that means, again, you would have a sered here under the lamed, all the way down, again, for your perfect. So you'd say something like male, maleti, and so forth. Okay, and then with this particular root, what you have is, again, you have mostly red, but then I have this little e. The little e refers to the 3ms form, but also it could refer to the stative forms of also your 3fs and your 3cp. But basically, you see this little e, what you're really looking at is the 3ms form, and that's it. Outside the 3ms form, you're looking at red here. And so with this root here, for the 3ms, it's going to be ka-tave with the sered. But if you do like a 1cs, you're going to get something like katav with the patach, katavti. And so there you'd go back again to the patach. Okay, and then you have a form for this particular root here, gadal, where it's read in both, you see. So both in the perfect and in the imperfect imperative, you get the patach. And then finally, you get this form here, which katon, which in the perfect, you'll get an orange holam. But again, in the imperfect imperative, you'll get the patach, and you'll say something like yiktan. Okay, what you notice in the stative is that the stative goes from, there's sort of an evolution here with the stative. You get all green in the perfect to just a little bit of green, but mostly red, to all red. And so, forgetting this last one here, but you can see there's a certain evolution again from all green to just a little bit green and then all red. You can see that many of the stative verbs are really being influenced by the more common standard verbs. The standard verbs are far more common than statives, and what's going on here probably is that the original stative, which was all green and all orange, you can see the green ones are becoming more red, just like the standard verbs. And so these more rare forms, the statives are probably maybe 10% of verbs. The standards are 90%, large majority. And so these rare forms, or you can see, are starting to conform more and more to standard verbs. And this is what you see in Hebrew. The distinction between standard and stative verbs is breaking down in biblical Hebrew, so that verbs that were originally stative are becoming, let's say, standard in meaning. And then some standard verbs are actually becoming stative in meaning. So there's confusion sometimes in the meanings of words between the statives and the standards. And you can see that even in form, some of the stative verbs are looking more and more like standard verbs. So we must keep that in mind. But yet this distinction is still important, because as we learn the call, we must understand the differences between the standard and statives. Okay, so with that said, we now want to look at section 3. We want to look at stative verbs, the perfect. And when you look at the left column, you'll see that column is identical to your standard verb that you've learned so far, katalti, katalta, and so forth, except when you get to the 3ms. And there you see the green sere, ka-tave. And so there you see the major difference in the call perfect. And then everything else is going to look, again, very similar to what you've already learned. So there's very little new memorization for you here. When you look at the right column, again, you're going to have the orange holum, as opposed to what you're used to seeing, like a patach. But with that one change, you basically see that holum all the way down. And if you look at the 1CP, you have a contracted form. The final noon is contracting with the noon of the suffix of the 1CP. And so that's why that form looks a little different. But other than that, again, this is very similar to what you've learned. All you have to do is adjust the thematic vowel. With this particular root, katon, again, you just want to simply go with a holum all the way down. And if you do that, you're going to be fine. But again, notice that when you have vocalic endings, all of these get reduced to a vocal schwa. Okay. Now when you look at section 4, you have the imperfect. And again, if you look at the left column, and for that matter, well, let's look at the left column first. When you look at the left column there in section 4, again, it's really identical to what you've learned before. The only difference being that what you have here is patach as opposed to what you've learned so far, which is the orange holum. So now you're going with a red patach, and you see that again all the way down. And, but again, you'll get reduction when you have a vocalic ending, so there's no change there. So again, these changes are simply changes in vowels of the thematic vowel. Other than that, the forms are identical, and that's, of course, good news for you. If you look at the right column, again, the same situation. You're looking at all red all the way down. Again, with vocalic endings, you're getting reduction of this red patach. And when you go down to your 2 and 3 FP, again, you're getting contraction with the final na, the suffix na, with the final letter, the final noon of the root. You're getting some contraction. But again, that shouldn't cause you any trouble. And when you look at the cohortative, and I give you the jussive and the imperfect with vav consecutive, shouldn't be much problem there. Again, the only difference is the color of the thematic vowel, or you know, whether it's patach and so forth. When you look at section 5 of chapter 21, again, not a big problem to you. It's, again, just a simple change in thematic vowel. And again, in the left column, you're going to get the red patach, and then of course, you're going to get reduction in certain places. And it's the same thing for katon. You're going to get the red patach also. And with the emphatic imperative, though, you'll go back to kov da, as I have written there. So watch out for the emphatic imperative. That is a little different that you need to learn. If you look at section 6 now, you have the participle. And the participle is different. And we want to take a look at the participle. The participle is different than in the standard verb, and so we want to take a look at that. Here is the participle in the stative verb, and of course you can see there's a difference, and that's the kametz under the kaf. In the standard verb, of course, you would get that holum between after the first root letter. Here you get the kametz. And again, you can see that this is a stative in the sense of an adjective. That adjective, this has more of the adjective look to it, and so you have to watch for that difference. Also, something very important to note, and I have it in italics in section 6 here, and that is that the participle, masculine singular absolute, is identical to the perfect 3ms, and so you want to keep that in mind. Now, when this participle is in construct, you're going to get reduction because, again, this goes back to an original patach, and so this is going to actually reduce to a vocal schwa. But the seire this time is going to stay intact, and that's a bit strange for us. That's different. You would expect that as the accent shifts over to the next word, you would expect that to become shortened, but it's actually going to stay. So if you look at the examples, you can see kaved, the masculine singular absolute, but when you go to the construct, you get the reduction under the kaf, the original patach, going down to a vocal schwa. But notice the seire remains, and it remains all the way down. And again, this is a difference that you really have to pay attention to. In the standard, if you recall, any type of ending, and you would have reduced the original short vowel, the hiric that would be under here. But in the stative, the hiric has, of course, been lengthened, and it stays long, and it does not reduce. And so you have to keep that in mind. And you'll see the same thing with katon, the same exact thing with the reduction under R1, the original patach reducing. But again, the holum will be indestructible. It will not reduce. And so you want to keep that in mind. When you go to the infinitives, the infinitive absolute is exactly the same as in the standard verb, so there's nothing new to learn there. But in the infinitive construct, notice again the thematic vowel will be a patach. It will not be the holum, and so again, you want to keep that in mind. That is also a difference between the standard verb, and so you want to take note of that. Now in section 8, we talk about the additional tense options for the perfect. When you learned the perfect a few chapters back, of course, we just made it a simple past tense or a English perfect tense. But now also we're allowing you to translate it as a present tense under certain circumstances. First of all, a stative verb. Frequently, a stative verb is to be translated as a present tense. And so you can see the example I give you, kaved, he is heavy. And then ahev, he loves, and so forth. Standard verbs that express a state of mind, like to remember, trust, knows, any verb that expresses a state of mind can also be translated as a present tense in Hebrew. But if context demands for a stative verb or a standard verb that expresses state of mind to be translated as a past tense, you can do that also. The tense options in Hebrew are quite flexible compared to English, and so context makes a big difference when it comes to the selection of tenses when you're looking at the perfect and, for that matter, the imperfect too. So again, stative verbs can often be translated as present tense, and also standard verbs that express state of mind. And so again, with the statives, some will have a stative form but more of an active or standard type meaning. And then sometimes you will get some standard verbs that will become more stative in meaning. You do want to keep that in mind, and you'll have to learn that as you're learning vocabulary, and you'll see that as you learn vocabulary. Well, that's it for the stative verb. It's now up to you to master the chapter and to do the questions, learn the vocabulary, and do your drills.